part 3. I got the slave cylinder back in, but it wasn't easy. I had to learn a couple things along the way. Basically, how I got it connected without taking that plate off right there is I basically went up top and took off those 2 bolts right there, and that gave me more play with the line down at the slave cylinder, making it easier to connect. Now I've done a gravity bleed on this. It's basically you leave the cap off the reservoir. You add brake fluid to it, fill it up, not too high, but you know, just enough so it doesn't run out if you're bleeding yourself. And then you come down here. Well, one thing I have to mention is inside the car, you have to disconnect that right there when you're bleeding the system. I didn't disconnect it. I was bleeding it, but after I finished bleeding, I couldn't get the slave cylinder rod pushed in by hand. There was just too much pressure. So what I did was I disconnected right here, and voila, I was able to push the I did a re-bleed just to make sure all the air is out of the system, and basically it worked out. So I got to push the slave cylinder back in by hand. Now what I did to push it in is I tied a shoelace around the tip of it, and basically I tied it tight, and I used the shoelace to pull back the pin and get it inside the knuckle or the spoon, whatever you want to call it. So that's what I did. It worked out great. So now it's time for me to get these bolts back in. Cut that shoelace out. I've checked to see whether or not the clutch is engaging or not, and it is fine. As you can see, the clutch is engaging. Took a lot of bleeding to get all the air out, and also some debris came up through the lines. I probably could have done a flush out, another flush out to clean out the lines, but you know what, that's a lot of work, so I would recommend it though, flushing out the whole system again with some brake fluid. But it's up to you. So I reconnect everything here. Everything's reconnected inside the car. Time to put the car back together. While you're doing this job, it's a good idea to check your bushings for your shifter bushings on the outside here, because they're located underneath the battery plate, and hard to get at if the battery's in there. But I checked mine, and there was no rubber bushing inside this one right here. So what I did was I took an old muffler hanger rubber piece, and I cut out a bushing and used the hole that was pre-made in it to go around this little stud here. And then I created my own little cotter pin to hold that bushing in. It tightened up my shifting a little bit, I would recommend doing your inside shifter bushings as well if you have a lot of play in your shifter. So I've cleaned out the reservoir. It's nice and clean in there. Actually, there's a bug in there. Just take that out. After I was done and got the slave cylinder back in, this was almost up to the top. I just used a straw and took some of the fluid out, just by hand. So I've cleaned up my battery mount there and a little bit of the transmission mount, just with some, cleaned up all the rust, sprayed it with some rocker guard, just to make it look a little bit better. Also did the battery plate, redid that as well, nice and coated, should stop it from rusting. Okay, so now I have everything reconnected up here. Cleaned some stuff up, cleaned up my battery, cleaned up battery plate. I didn't bother cleaning the breather box because I'm going to be switching that out to a cold air intake at some point. Reconnected all the lines down here. Well, not the lines, but I tightened the bolts, so I'm ready to test it out. I'm going to leave the shoelace on while I'm in the driveway, while I test out shifting gears with the car on. Okay, so I've lowered the vehicle, turned it on. You'll know right away whether you can shift into gear or not. I couldn't shift into gear, so it's moving it, but I obviously might have to do some more bleeding here. So I've taken it out again, just lift up the car again, take it out. I'm kind of using this thing here to go around the nipple there, and I'm using this as my pusher to push the piston back in, so I have something to grip with my hand so you don't hurt yourself. So I did about 4 pushes all the way in and all the way out. Big chunk of fluid went in. That's a good thing. I just got to keep trying and bleeding until the system works. Okay guys, so I can finally change gears. I had to bleed it one more time. Some fluid went back down to the system. I'm going to do it a couple more times just to be sure. I don't want any slipping while I'm driving. So it's probably your best bet to bleed it again, even if you think it's lead. So that's it. Clutch is working, gears are shifting. I'm about to take it for a test drive. If I have to, I'll do some more bleeding, but everything's done. Everything's reconnected in the inside, underneath where the clutch pedal is. Everything's reconnected down where the slave cylinder is. Everything's looking good. So thanks for watching. Anybody who would like to know anything about Neons, I'm pretty good at most things with them, so just give me a shout or send me an email or like the video.